The Prince of Soul was dying, and nobody knew. Marvin Gaye lay unconscious on a cold bathroom floor while the world slept outside. Only one man stood between him and death, a janitor who had lost everything and had every reason to walk away. But Samuel Washington didn't walk away. Instead, he did something that would change both their lives forever. What he said to Marvin in those dark hours would become the secret behind one of music's greatest comebacks. If stories of ordinary people changing extraordinary lives move you, please subscribe to our channel for more untold tales of the heroes who saved our music legends. The recording studio was supposed to be empty that night. Samuel Washington had been cleaning Sunset Sound Studios for 12 years, arriving at 11 p.m. when the musicians and producers had gone home, leaving behind their cigarette butts, empty bottles and dreams half captured on magnetic tape. He was 68 years old, wore the same gray coveralls every night, and most people who passed him in the hallways never bothered to learn his name. But Samuel didn't mind being invisible. In fact, after everything he had lost, invisibility felt like a kind of mercy. That February night started like any other. Samuel pushed his cleaning cart through the silent corridors, the wheels squeaking against the polished floors, his keys jangling from his belt loop. Studio A had been booked by some young rock band who had left pizza boxes everywhere. Studio B smelled like expensive cologne and cheap wine. But when he reached Studio C, something felt different. The air was heavy, thick with something he couldn't name but recognized in his bones. The bathroom light was on, a thin yellow line bleeding out from under the door. Samuel knocked twice. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time, and called out that he needed to clean. Still nothing. That's when he heard it, or rather didn't hear it. The absence of sound can be louder than noise, and the silence behind that door screamed at him with an urgency that made his hands shake as he fumbled for his master key. What he found when he opened that door would haunt him for the rest of his life, but it would also give him a purpose he thought he had lost forever. Marvin Gaye was lying on the cold tile floor, his body curled into itself like a question mark, his breathing so shallow that Samuel had to kneel down and put his ear close to Marvin's mouth to make sure he was still alive. The great soul singer's face was pale, almost gray, and there were pill bottles scattered around him like fallen soldiers. Samuel's first instinct was to call 911, to get help, to do what any reasonable person would do in this situation. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the way Marvin's hand was clutching a photograph, the edges worn soft from being touched too many times. Maybe it was the look on the singer's face, even unconscious, expression of such profound pain that it reminded Samuel of his own son's face the last time he had seen him alive. Or maybe it was simply that Samuel Washington understood, in a way that most people couldn't, what it meant to be at the absolute end of your rope with nowhere left to fall. Instead of calling for help, Samuel did something that defied all logic and protocol. He lifted Marvin's head gently, supporting it against his lap, and began talking to him. Not shouting, not slapping his face to wake him up, but talking in the same low, steady voice he had once used to calm frightened soldiers in a place very far from Los Angeles. Samuel had served as a medic in Korea, and he had learned that sometimes the sound of another human voice, speaking with certainty and compassion, could pull someone back from the edge when nothing else could. What Samuel said in those first crucial minutes would remain between him and Marvin for the rest of their lives. But slowly, painfully, Marvin began to respond. His eyelids fluttered, his breathing deepened, and eventually, after what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, he opened his eyes and looked up at the old man holding him. The recognition in Marvin's eyes wasn't about fame or celebrity. It was the recognition of one broken human being seeing himself reflected in another. Samuel helped Marvin sit up slowly, then moved him out of the bathroom to the studio couch, a worn leather thing that had supported the weight of countless musicians over the years. He made Marvin drink water, just small sips at first, and checked his pulse the way he had been trained to do 3 decades earlier on a battlefield most Americans wanted to forget. But here's what most people don't know about that night, the detail that would change everything. As Samuel helped Marvin onto that couch, the photograph the singer had been clutching fell to the floor. It was a picture of a young man in military uniform, smiling at the camera with the kind of innocence that only exists before war teaches you otherwise. Samuel picked up the photograph and felt his own heart stop for just a moment. The young man in the picture looked almost exactly like Samuel's own son David, who had been killed in Vietnam in 1968. The resemblance was so striking that Samuel had to blink several times to make sure he wasn't hallucinating. When he looked up at Marvin with questions in his eyes, the singer managed to whisper 2 words that would forge an unbreakable bond between them. "My brother." Marvin's brother Frankie had served in Vietnam, had come home damaged in ways that never completely healed, and the guilt Marvin carried about his brother's service had eaten away at him for years. He had written songs about it, most famously in his album What's Going On, but writing songs hadn't been enough to silence the demons that whispered in the dark hours of the morning. Samuel understood this guilt in a way that few others could, because he carried his own version of it, the crushing weight of having survived when his son had not. What happened over the next 6 hours in that studio was something rare and precious, a conversation between two men who had every reason to be strangers but found themselves connected by grief, loss, and the particular kind of survivor's guilt that comes from watching war destroy the people you love. Samuel told Marvin about David, about the telegram that had arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, about how his wife had never recovered from the loss and had passed away just 2 years later, leaving Samuel alone in a world that suddenly felt too big and too empty. Marvin in turn talked about Frankie, about the brother who had gone to war while Marvin stayed home and made music, about the complicated feelings of relief and shame that came with that survival. But more than that, Marvin talked about the darkness that had been closing in on him for months, the cocaine addiction that had spiraled out of control, the financial troubles that seemed insurmountable, the feeling that his best work was behind him and that he had nothing left to offer the world. Samuel listened, really listened, in the way that only someone who has been to the bottom themselves can listen to another person describing their descent. He didn't offer easy platitudes or false comfort. He didn't tell Marvin to think positive or count his blessings. Instead, he told him something that would become the foundation of everything that came after. Samuel Washington told Marvin Gaye that healing wasn't about forgetting the pain or pretending it didn't exist. It was about finding a way to transform that pain into something that could help others, about taking the broken pieces of yourself and using them to build something new. He talked about how after losing David and then his wife, he had considered ending his own life more than once, had stood at the edge of that same darkness that Marvin was now facing. But Samuel had made a choice, a conscious decision to keep living, not because he was particularly brave or strong, but because he realized that his son's death would mean even less if he threw away the life that David had died protecting. Samuel had taken a job as a janitor, the most invisible position he could find, because he needed to be around life and creativity and the sound of people making beautiful things. Every night as he cleaned those studios, he listened to music being born, and somehow that had been enough to keep him going. This idea that pain could be transformed rather than simply endured or escaped struck something deep in Marvin's consciousness. The notion that his suffering wasn't meaningless, that it could actually become the raw material for something powerful and healing, planted a seed that would eventually grow into one of the most successful and emotionally resonant albums of his career. As dawn began to break outside the studio windows, Samuel made Marvin promise two things. First, that he would get help for his addiction, real professional help, not just promises to himself that he would quit tomorrow. Second, that he would take the pain he was feeling and put it into his music, not to glorify the suffering but to show others who were struggling that they weren't alone, that healing was possible even when it seemed impossible. Samuel Washington left the studio that morning believing he would probably never see Marvin Gaye again. He had done what he could, had pulled someone back from the edge the way he wished someone had been there to pull his son back. As he walked to the bus stop in the early morning light, he felt a strange sense of peace, as if helping Marvin had somehow brought him a step closer to forgiving himself for all the things he couldn't control. But the next day, when Samuel arrived for his shift at the studio, his supervisor told him someone was waiting for him in the parking lot. Samuel's first thought was that he was in trouble, that somehow word had gotten out about what had happened with Marvin and he was going to lose his job. His heart was pounding as he walked outside, preparing himself for confrontation or termination. Instead, he found Marvin Gaye leaning against a car, looking tired but alive, more alive than he had looked the night before. Marvin was holding something in his hands, and when he saw Samuel, he walked over with purpose and determination in his step. What happened next would become one of those moments that seems too perfect to be true, but sometimes life delivers exactly the kind of poetry it promises in songs. Marvin handed Samuel an envelope. Inside was a check for an amount that made the old janitor's hands shake. Enough money to pay off the mortgage on his small house that he had been in danger of losing. Enough to cover his late wife's medical bills that still haunted him. Enough to finally, after years of barely scraping by, have some breathing room and security. But that wasn't all. Marvin also handed him a set of keys. The keys were to a small apartment above a music store in Inglewood, a place that Marvin had just purchased and was offering to Samuel rent-free for as long as he wanted it. But more than the money or the apartment Marvin offered Samuel something that proved to be even more valuable. He offered him friendship, real friendship, the kind that is forged in the darkest moments and proves itself in the light of ordinary days. Over the next year and a half, Samuel Washington and Marvin Gaye formed a bond that defied all the usual categories of relationships. Samuel became something like a sponsor, someone Marvin could call at 3 in the morning when the urge to use was overwhelming, someone who understood the weight of survivor's guilt and the long, difficult work of learning to live with loss. Samuel attended Marvin's sessions with addiction counselors, not as a caretaker but as a witness, someone who had walked a similar path and could testify that the journey, while brutal, was worth taking. But the relationship wasn't one-sided. Marvin gave Samuel something equally precious. He gave him purpose. Samuel began working at Marvin's home studio, not as a janitor anymore, but as what Marvin called his keeper of the space, someone who maintained the environment where creativity happened. Samuel would arrive in the afternoons, and he and Marvin would talk for hours before any music was made, conversations that ranged from the profound to the mundane, from discussions about war and loss to debates about the best way to make coffee. These conversations became the foundation of the album that would resurrect Marvin's career and save his life in more ways than one. The album that would eventually be called Sexual Healing, though its title suggested something purely romantic or physical, was actually about a much deeper kind of healing, the kind that Samuel and Marvin were both working toward in their own ways. The sensuality in the music was real, but underneath it was a current of hard-won peace, of a man learning to inhabit his body and his life again, after wanting desperately to leave both behind. Here's something that music historians have missed for decades. If you listen carefully to Sexual Healing, not just the title track but the entire album, you can hear Samuel Washington's influence woven throughout. The themes of redemption, of finding light in darkness, of the slow, patient work of rebuilding a life. These weren't just poetic devices, they were the actual process that Marvin was living through with Samuel's guidance. There's a particular moment in the album and a song that didn't become a hit but might be the most honest thing Marvin ever recorded, where he talks about an old man who taught him how to breathe again. Most people assumed this was metaphorical, poetic license, the kind of thing songwriters do, but it was literal. Samuel had taught Marvin breathing exercises, techniques he had learned as a medic to help soldiers manage panic and pain, and these exercises had become part of Marvin's daily routine as he worked to stay clean and sane. Samuel was there for many of the recording sessions, sitting quietly in the corner, and his presence changed the energy in the room in ways that the other musicians noticed but couldn't quite articulate. There was something about having this older man, this witness to Marvin's transformation, that kept the sessions grounded and honest. When Marvin was tempted to rely on old habits or take shortcuts, a glance at Samuel would remind him why he was doing this work, who he was doing it for. The album was recorded primarily in Belgium, where Marvin had gone to escape his troubles in America, but before he left, Samuel gave him something to take with him. It was David's dog tags, the ones that had been returned to Samuel after his son's death, the ones he had carried with him every day for 15 years. Samuel told Marvin to keep them while he was recording, to remember that healing wasn't about forgetting the dead but about honoring them by living fully. Sexual Healing was released in October of 1982. Less than 2 years after that night on the bathroom floor at Sunset Sound Studios. The song became Marvin's biggest hit in years, reaching #1 on the charts and earning him his first Grammy Awards. But for Marvin and Samuel, the success of the album was secondary to what it represented. It was proof that transformation was possible, that you could go to the absolute bottom and still find your way back. During the promotional tour for the album, Marvin did something that shocked his managers and publicists. At several key interviews, he insisted on bringing Samuel Washington with him, not as an employee or an assistant, but as an equal, as the man he credited with saving his life. Some journalists didn't know what to make of this elderly janitor sitting next to one of music's biggest stars, but Marvin was adamant. Samuel's story, he insisted, was part of his story, and one couldn't be told honestly without the other. The publicity around Samuel's role in Marvin's recovery had unexpected consequences. Other musicians started reaching out to Samuel, asking for his guidance, his presence, his particular kind of wisdom that came from having survived the unsurvivable. Samuel, who had spent years being invisible, suddenly found himself in demand, not as a celebrity, but as a counselor, a sponsor, a living example of how to carry grief without being crushed by it. He helped 3 other prominent musicians get clean in the 18 months following Marvin's comeback, though he never spoke publicly about who they were. Samuel understood that his role wasn't to be famous or recognized. His role was to be present, to show up, to tell the truth about how hard the work of healing is and why it's worth doing anyway. The friendship between Samuel Washington and Marvin Gaye lasted until Marvin's tragic death in April of 1984. Samuel was one of the last people to speak with Marvin before the shooting that ended his life, a final phone call where they talked about fear and family and the ways that old wounds can resurface when we least expect them. Samuel would carry the weight of that last conversation for the rest of his life, wondering if there was something more he could have said, some way he could have prevented what happened. But here's what Samuel understood, what he told the reporters who asked him about Marvin's death, what he continued to tell other people who were struggling with addiction and depression. You can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved. You can offer them tools, you can show them a path, you can walk beside them for as long as they'll let you. But ultimately, everyone has to do their own work, fight their own battles, make their own choice about whether to keep going or give up. What Samuel had given Marvin was almost 2 years of life that might not have happened otherwise. 2 years where Marvin created some of his best work, reconnected with his children, experienced joy and creativity, and the satisfaction of overcoming something that had nearly destroyed him. Those 2 years mattered. They mattered to Marvin's family, to his fans, to the musicians he influenced, and most of all, they mattered to Samuel, who got to witness the transformation he had helped make possible. After Marvin's death, Samuel could have retreated back into invisibility, back into the safety of being just another old man that people looked past without seeing. But Marvin's death taught him something crucial. Every moment of connection matters. Every life we touch creates ripples we can't predict or control, and the work of healing, both our own and others, is never really finished. Samuel Washington lived until 2003, dying peacefully at the age of 88. In the 2 decades following Marvin's death, he continued to work with musicians, artists, and others struggling with addiction and trauma. He never wrote a book or sought publicity for his work. He simply showed up day after day, offering the same kind of presence and wisdom he had offered Marvin that night in the studio. At his funeral, over 300 people attended, many of them musicians whose names you would recognize, all of them people whose lives had been changed by knowing Samuel Washington. They told stories about a man who listened more than he spoke, who asked the right questions instead of offering easy answers, who understood that healing was a process, not an event, and who had the patience to walk with people through the darkest valleys of their lives. The story of how Samuel saved Marvin's life that night in 1983 has been told many times, but it's usually framed as a single heroic moment, one man rescuing another from death. The real story is more complex and more beautiful than that. It's about 2 broken men finding each other at exactly the right time, about a friendship that transcended all the usual boundaries of race and class and fame, about the way that our deepest pain, when shared with someone who understands, can become the foundation for healing. Sexual Healing wasn't just the title of a song or an album. It was a description of what Samuel and Marvin did for each other, the way they helped each other find a path back to life when both of them had reasons to give up. The album's success, the Grammy Awards, the chart positions, these things mattered, but they weren't the point. The point was that Marvin Gaye got 2 more years of life, 2 years where he was present for his children, where he created music that still moves people decades later, where he got to experience the satisfaction of overcoming his demons, at least for a while. And Samuel Washington got something equally precious. He got to transform his grief over losing his son into something that helped others, to take the worst thing that had ever happened to him and use it as a tool for healing. He got to be seen, really seen, by someone who understood what it cost to keep living when part of you wanted to die. He got to know that his life mattered, that his presence made a difference, that the pain he had survived hadn't been meaningless. In the end, the story of Samuel Washington and Marvin Gaye reminds us that the most important people in our lives are often the ones we never expect. Not the famous or the powerful or the obviously heroic, but the ordinary people who show up at the right moment with exactly what we need, even if what we need is just someone to sit with us in the darkness and remind us that morning will come. Samuel was just a janitor, a man in gray coveralls pushing a cleaning cart through empty hallways, someone that most people never noticed or remembered. But to Marvin Gaye, in his darkest hour, Samuel Washington was everything. He was hope when hope seemed impossible, wisdom when confusion was overwhelming, and most importantly, he was proof that you could survive the unsurvivable and still find reasons to keep going. The world remembers Marvin Gaye for his voice, his songs, his contribution to music history. But perhaps we should also remember him for having the wisdom to recognize salvation when it appeared in the form of a 68-year-old janitor with kind eyes and a story about a son who never came home from war. And we should remember Samuel Washington, not as a footnote to someone else's story, but as a hero in his own right, a man who took his deepest pain and transformed it into a gift he could offer others. That night in February 1983, in a bathroom at Sunset Sound Studios, Samuel Washington saved Marvin Gaye's life. But the truth is more complicated and more beautiful than that. They saved each other, two broken men finding wholeness together, proving that healing is possible, that transformation is real, and that sometimes the most extraordinary thing you can do is simply show up for another human being when they need you most.